Okay, so I was kind of sitting down here one day wondering what other books we should cover on the channel. And I went through a lot of different ideas and some of y'all opinions as well from earlier posts on YouTube. But for me, I was kind of like, man, what should we cover on the channel that other people don't really cover on YouTube? And I realized that you did have some people try to cover the Marvel Noir books, but most of the time, they only cover Spider-Man, and that's really it. And occasionally, Iron Man or possibly Daredevil. But there were a ton of different noir books that came out in the late 2000s going into the 2010s. Besides Spider-Man and X-Men and Daredevil, you had Luke Cage, you had the Punisher, you had Iron Man, you had Wolverine, Weapon X. You had a lot of different noir books that came out in the late 2000s. I felt like it would be a good idea for us to at least cover some of the books that most people are not even talking about, like Punisher Noir, for today's video. Now, just in case you're new to comics, you have no idea what the whole noir thing is about. You see, in the late 2000s, when it came to Marvel Comics, they thought it'd be a good idea to take some heroes that were already established in the world of comics and put those characters in a different universe that took place in the 1930s. So the question was, what would happen to Spider-Man if he had appeared in the 1930s? Or what would Iron Man be like in the 1930s? It was a cool idea for old heroes being re-established in a different decade in time and see what it'd be like for those characters. And so that's why I say for the Punisher, it was a very cool idea because he's still mostly similar, but at the same time, we got a whole new kind of story for the character that was not really done before. And so getting into the opening pages for today's storyline, we do pick up in the year 1935. And we pick up with, well, this random guy who's just right now sitting on the bed listening to a radio show about the Punisher. Because back in the 1930s, you didn't have a TV. You had the radio that would do different shows about different things. And sometimes it would be fictional shows. And so right now this guy is listening to a show about a fictional character known as the Punisher who goes after different monsters in the city. And so while the show goes on, this guy begins to get ready. And by the end of the section, we get our first look of the Punisher. But we have no idea who is the Punisher just yet. And so now we have to go back in time to hopefully learn more about the origin of the Punisher in the noir universe. And so to begin, we got to go back in time to the year 1918. And we pick up with a character known as Frank Calcione Sr. And we see him right now fighting at the tail end of World War I. Now, when it comes to Frank in these pages right here, we get the idea that he is one heck of a soldier. The dude's out there just killing people left and right. And he calls himself the Angel of Death. And matter of fact, he has a tattoo on his chest to kind of show off that he is the Angel of Death. Like I said though, the dude is one heck of a soldier back at the tail end of World War I. But his main goal was to get back home to his wife, to get back home to his son. And so he was able to survive and finish off World War I and being able to go back home. Except once he's able to go back home, he comes to find out that his wife, Ruth, she has cancer. And matter of fact, she dies. And so unfortunately, it's up to him now to raise his son on his own. Frank Calcione Jr. And so for Frank, he's kind of wondering how the outside world would affect their son with culture or religion or just bad people out there. And so for Frank, his main goal is to make sure his son stays on the right path. But of course, you can't always watch your son 24/7 to believe that he'll stay on the right path. And matter of fact, when it comes to Frank, when he looks out the window, he realized that his son is beginning to fall into the wrong crowd of kids. And so now we pick up in the year 1928 and we pick up with Frank Calcione Jr. Now with Frank Jr., we see him falling into the wrong crowd of children, the bad boys of the neighborhood. And we see him and those bad boys go out of their way to rob an adult of their money. Now to the boys, they believe they were able to get a lot of money to spend for their own personal needs. But then you have Frank Sr. stop them, take the money away and tell Frank Jr. they're going to give the money back to the man. Now, again, for Frank Sr., his main goal is to keep his son on the right path. But again, you cannot always watch your kids 24/7 and hope they stay on the right path. But you do have Frank still trying his best as a single father. Now, we also learned for Frank Castle Sr. or Frank Calcione Sr. that he has his own little shop in the neighborhood as a way to make some money to survive, but it also makes some money to take care of Frank Jr. Now, while you have the two guys and their employee trying to close down for the night, you then have two gangsters walk into the building. Now, these two gangsters, they came there to tell Frank that other shops in the neighborhood have begun to pay for protection, but Frank has not. And honestly, Frank is not going to, but they believe they should be able to scare him enough to make him pay for protection. Except you have Frank Sr. begin to fight against the two gangsters. Now, by the end of the fight, you have Frank Jr. being able to get a gun and point that gun at them to make them run away. Now, Frank Jr., he wants to know why in the world would his father not just go ahead and pay for protection as a way to have them leave his store alone? Because to Frank Jr., it's cheaper to just go ahead and pay them to leave his store alone because it costs them more money to always clean up the place after they attack the place to get protection money out of Frank Sr. But if Frank Sr. is more of like, dude, I fought in World War I and earned my hard-earned money. There's no way, and you know what, I'll give my hard-earned money over to them because they say so. No, it's my money and they have no right to it. And that right there is really important. But getting into the ending for the first chapter, we then pick up those two gangsters earlier, run back to their boss. Now, their boss is a character known as Dutch Schultz, and I really hope I pronounced that last name correctly. But for Dutch, he was a real monster in the real world back in the 1930s. So it's kind of cool to see him in this comic book series right here. But for Dutch, he hates the idea of hearing that these two guys were not able to collect any money from Frank Sr. And so unfortunately, they had to lose some fingers, but also it's him saying, every single day you fail me to get money out of Frank Sr., I'm gonna take a finger from you. So you better get back out there and find a way to earn my money. And that's the ending for just the first chapter alone. And so as we dive into the second chapter of the storyline, we do pick up in the year 1935 once again, except this time we pick up with a bunch of dead bodies just laying out there in the middle of the bar. Now, here's the thing. You have two detectives walk in, and at first they believe that all these men had died thanks to other gangs in the city who were trying to get rid of Dutch and his gang as well. But then you have Detective Soap walk into the room. Now, for Detective Soap, he believes it's somebody else who's coming after Dutch, somebody known as the Punisher. Now, here's the thing. In the year 1935, the Punisher is a myth. Or it's the Punisher from the radio show. So no one truly believes there's somebody out there known as the Punisher. But for Soap, he believes there's somebody out there known as the Punisher, and that person is coming after, well, of course, Dutch. But now we have to jump back over to the year 1918, where you have Frank Sr. telling Frank Jr. this story of him on his way home after being in World War I. Except on the train on the way home, he runs into a character known as the Russian. Now, the Russian is a mercenary that people pay to, go after people and kill them. So somebody out there was really upset with Frank Sr. They hired the Russian to go kill him. And so we get a lot of pages of these two characters battling against one another. Now, luckily for the Punisher, Frank Sr. here, he was able to have a grenade in his back pocket and put it inside the pants of, well, the Russian. And so we're left to believe that the Russian is officially dead once grenade does go off. But the reason why you had Frank Sr. trying to tell Frank Jr. that story is really more saying like, dude, you have to be prepared for anything, because you never know when somebody or something might come out of nowhere and possibly do something to you that could possibly end your life. So you always need to be prepared for anything. Or Frank Jr., he's a child. So for him, it's like, okay, you say so, Dad, but in reality, I'm not listening. Instead, I want you to go ahead and continue to show me how to use a gun. Now, Frank Sr., he knows his son is not listening, but at the same time, he's like, my son needs to know how to use all these different kinds of guns and weapons. And so they continue to train with one another. Now, when we jump back over to Dutch, we do learn that for him, he had been sending in different guys to go after Frank Sr. But unfortunately, all those different guys have not been able to do anything to Frank Sr. at all. And matter of fact, let's not forget, if you fail him, you lose a finger. So the dude has a whole entire briefcase of just fingers from different members of his gang, of different people who had failed him when it comes to going after Frank Sr. And so Dutch says, you know what? It's time for me to go ahead and bring in the big guns. And so this begins the reimagining of different villains that the Punisher had fought back over in the main Marvel universe, now being reimagined in this reality. Like, for example, Barracuda. Now, in this reality, Barracuda is just a hitman for a guy who has a club. Anytime there is another club being able to make more money than his club, he sends in Barracuda to close down that business, meaning that killing off every single person in that club. But that's one person that Dutch calls in. The next person he calls in would be Jigsaw. Now, Jigsaw is a big-time classic character for the Punisher. But either way, in this reality, when it comes to Jigsaw, he's a big-time hitter from Chicago. But for Dutch, he has to call him in. He needs their help to go after the Punisher, Frank Sr., to hopefully get rid of him once and for all. So 3 days later, we pick up those two guys heading over to the home of Frank Sr. Now, we do learn here that there was a third person called in, but we have no idea who that third person is. All we do know is that that third person came there to help other two guys take on Frank Sr. They break into his home, but Frank was ready to go. He had two guns ready to go, and he begins blasting at the two guys. But before we are able to learn what happened to Frank Sr., we jump over to Frank Jr. And remember, earlier we had Frank Sr. tell us that Jr. was falling into the wrong crowd of kids. And so right now, is Frank Jr. and those kids thinking about breaking into a church to steal money from a church? Now, Frank Jr., he realized that this is completely wrong, that he realized that he had fallen into the wrong crowd of children. And so you have Frank Jr. leave to go back home to his father. But the problem is that as soon as he gets home, there are police officers everywhere. And you have Frank Jr. walk in. And we come to find out that Frank Sr. is dead, which means in 1938, Frank Sr. is not the Punisher at all. He died by the hands of the big hitters for Dutch. But as we get into the third chapter of the storyline, we can now jump back over the year 1935. And we now pick up with Dutch right now pretending to be Santa Claus for a bunch of kids in the area. But while doing that, he's then confronted by Detective Soap. Now we do learn here from Soap that apparently Dutch is on the run, that he had left behind his old territory. And the reason why, because all the different gangs in that area began to come after him all at once, especially one gang. But you also have Soap saying that he knows the actual truth of why Dutch ran away, because of a certain mask vigilante. And of course, he is talking about the Punisher. Now for Dutch, he pretends that he has no idea what Soap is talking about, but in reality, he does. And so once you have Soap leave, you have Dutch say, okay, it's time for me to go ahead and call in her, because I need her to take care of another problem of mine. But now we have to jump over to Chicago, the South Side, and we pick up with Jigsaw. Now, in the early parts of this section, it's really more of Jigsaw attacking a prostitute. And the reason why, because I guess before they were able to do their activity for the night, she had a weird look on her face of disgust because the way his face looked. And he got mad and he cut her. Now, while he was leaving, he realized that somebody was following him. And that would be, well, the Punisher. Now, unfortunately for the Punisher, he is easily caught off guard by Jigsaw. And you had Jigsaw say, you know what? Let me go ahead and take you in for the night and begin to torture you because you try to come after me and kill me from behind, but you had completely failed. And he also takes off the mask of the Punisher. And we get a good look of this guy. But now we have to jump over to Coney Island. And when we do, we pick up Barracuda with one of his ladies for the night. Now, while out there, you then have the Punisher once again try to go after him as well. But just like Jigsaw we saw earlier, that Barracuda was able to get one over on the Punisher and begin to take him down as well. But now we are able to jump back over to Chicago. And when we do, we pick up with Jigsaw just now torturing the Punisher. Now, while doing that, you would think like, okay, it's Jigsaw trying to get information out of the Punisher. But in reality, no. For Jigsaw, he loves the idea of just torturing the Punisher, just cutting him up left and right. And so, unfortunately for the Punisher, he has no choice but to sit there and just take all this torturing that Jigsaw is giving him. But before we were able to learn what would happen to the Punisher when it comes to Jigsaw, we now got to jump back over to Coney Island and we see the Punisher still trying his best to fight against Barracuda. Now, their battle does go on for like a few more pages, but you didn't have the Punisher being able to drop part of a roller coaster on top of Barracuda as a way to knock him out, but he was just barely able to pull that off. But now with the Punisher, it's now time for him to collect information from Barracuda. But as we jump back over to Chicago and see Jigsaw continuing to torture the Punisher, this is the moment where we learn that this is Frank Jr. all grown up. He became the Punisher, and his main goal is to go after the different people who had killed off his father. And so right now, it's Jigsaw at the moment. And so for Jigsaw, he's just loving the idea of torturing Frank Jr. But then you have Frank Jr. say, hey, listen, before I supposedly die, I want to know the name of the third person who had pulled the trigger that had killed off my father. I want to know about her. And so you have Jigsaw tell Frank Jr. everything he wants to know. And then you have Jigsaw realize that Frank Jr. was able to break out of his binds, get up, and he kills Jigsaw off just like that. But now he was able to get the info that he was looking for. But as we jump back over to Coney Island, we learn here that this part storyline takes place before the Chicago one, because you now have the Punisher torturing Barracuda to learn the name of the third person, the female. But Barracuda did not tell the Punisher anything at all. And matter of fact, he says one down after he kills off Barracuda, which means that he killed off Jigsaw after he killed off Barracuda. But either way, now with the Punisher, we now know he has the name of the third person who had pulled the trigger that had killed off Frank Sr. in the second chapter. But now his goal is to go after her, but to also go after Dutch as well. And so to close on the third chapter, we do pick up with, well, Dutch meeting up with her. And we kind of find out that her is somebody who had recently transitioned over into a woman. But either way, it's just saying like, I need your help to go after the Punisher. And her says, yeah, I am down to go after him. So there we go. Now she's assigned to hopefully kill off Frank Jr. And so as we get into the fourth chapter, we do pick up in a hospital, and we do pick up one of the guys who worked for Dutch. Now, this guy has gone insane, and we have no idea why in the world he has gone insane. But apparently he saw something. Something happened to Dutch. And so now I got to jump back in time to figure out what exactly went down when it came to Dutch and what he saw happen to Dutch. So now we have to jump back in time hours ago, and we pick up with Frank Jr. And you have Frank Jr. still being the Punisher, but now he's meeting up with her at the zoo in the Bronx. Now, we do learn here that her is actually the Russian from the second chapter, the one Frank Sr. fought on the train and we thought had died when he put the grenade in his pants. But in reality, he has survived. Now, with the grenade, he did lose some body parts. And so, with him losing those body parts, he went ahead and just transitioned over to a female. But either way, he's now trying to kill off Frank Jr., who's better known as the Punisher. And so this leads into a long battle between the two characters. Now, let me tell you, it gets really bloody in this battle. You got animals dying left and right. You got folks being stabbed left and right. Like, it's a bloody battle. But by the end of the section, you do have the Punisher coming out victorious. Like, he was able to go ahead and kill off the Russian, but just barely. Now, when the police arrive, they find the Russian, but they also find the mask on top of the face of the Russian. And so now we pick up hours later. And when we do, we pick up with Dutch freaking out. And the reason why? Because the commission is coming after him. Now, the commission was a real group back in the 1930s. They were kind of like the government body for all the different mafia groups back then. But they told Dutch in real life, you are not allowed to go after a certain public figure. But just like in real life, when it came to Dutch, he ignored what they said. In real life, they had sent 2 assassins to kill off Dutch. In this book, the same thing happened. But in this book, you had the Punisher being able to get there first to kill off Dutch. But for the assassins, when they find Dutch and he's dead, they can take the credit for it. But either way, their job was done and Dutch is now dead. And for the Punisher, he was able to get revenge for his father. And so as we get back to the present day, we pick up with that guy once again who was freaking out because of what he saw. And now we know what he saw. He saw the Punisher kill off Dutch, but he also heard all those gunshots. The 2 assassins from the commission, they had killed off almost every single member of Dutch's gang in that building. They didn't find him because he was in the bathroom hiding, but he heard everything. He saw everything. And so unfortunately, that is why the man had gone insane. Now, for the police officers, they're saying that the Russian was the Punisher because they found the Russian dead with the Punisher mask on top of their face. But on top of that, they're going to pin the death of Dutch onto the guy they found earlier who had gone insane. So Frank Jr., he's now able to walk away free without having any problems at all. But now he's wondering what he should do next, who he should punish next. And then he reads the newspaper about World War II. And his next target is Hitler. And the book ends on that note right there. And so with that being said, guys, please leave me a like down below and subscribe. But guys, I'll see you in the next comic book video.